I should like to state at the start that I am not now and never have been a communist.
Ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor.
If I am lying, I should go to jail. If Mr. Chambers is lying, he should go to jail.
I am not and never have been a communist.
In this cell, there was also Owen J. Lattimore.
All that Senator McCarthy has been trying to do is expose the communists who have infiltrated the Department of the Army.
And let me say that I am honored when people come up to me on the streets, perhaps I don't deserve this honor, and say, you're the man who killed Joe McCarthy.
The rapid decline of the power and prestige of the United States undoubtedly will be recorded by future scholars as one of the most amazing events in history. With the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945, the United States stood at the apex of world leadership. She commanded the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. Her economy bolstered scores of nations. She was respected even by her conquered enemies. But long before the children born in that war could vote, the tide had already turned. And by the time their children had grown, the United States had retreated from victory and was struggling for survival in a hostile world. Her military forces had become inferior to those of her enemies. Her economy was reeling under attack by foreign competitors. She was at the mercy of outside energy sources. Her alliances were crumbling. She was hated and jeered at the United Nations. She had been forced to retreat on every continent, while during that same time, over 70 million people each year were being absorbed by international communism. All of this in less than 2 generations. Now the question is why? The accepted view in many circles is that it just happened that way. There were no particular reasons except the normal changing currents of history in an era of rising expectations. There is, of course, another view, a view that is more skeptical of the supposed blind forces of history, and which sees events as caused by people with motives and goals and long-range plans. This is the conspiratorial view of history, as opposed to the accidental view, and it is the conspiratorial view that we shall present in this program. It's our specific purpose to explore the possibility that America, but by the subversion factor.
The most significant aspect of communist expansion since 1945 is the fact that it has not been accomplished by traditional military force. These countries were not conquered by external invasion of Soviet troops, but by internal terrorism, revolution, and subversion by people who were citizens of each target nation. In 1967, Soviet Premier Brezhnev said, "Marxist-Leninists have always understood that socialism cannot be implanted by one country into another by military force, that it is the product of the internal development of a given society." Brezhnev's predecessor, Nikita Khrushchev, was even more explicit when he said, "I am convinced that tomorrow the red flag will fly over the United States, but we will not fly the flag. It will be the American people themselves." The historical record is clear. The prime directive of communist strategy is conquest. The most important lesson to be learned is that at the time of takeover, the actual number of communists in any country is usually less than 3%, and in many cases, such as the Soviet Union itself, it has been less than 1% of the total population. The place to begin this inquiry, therefore, is to examine the strategy by which a tiny minority can capture control of an existing government. The success of this strategy has been largely the result of 2 factors working together. One is the mobilization of mass action among the non-communist population, demonstrations, general strikes, or insurrection. The other is the paralysis of the target government, the inability to fight back effectively, indecision, delays, blunders. It's not surprising, therefore, to learn that a major part of communist strategy is devoted to techniques for creating exactly these two conditions: mobilization of the masses and paralysis of the government. In August of 1922, at a secluded resort near Bridgman, Michigan, law enforcement officers raided a meeting of the top leaders of the Communist Party of America. Hundreds of secret documents were seized. One of the most revealing of these was a directive from Moscow, signed by members of the Executive Committee of the Communist International. In this document, it was firmly established that the Communist Party of America was not independent, but merely a branch of the international organization under firm control of the Soviets. The directive said, "The ruling of the Communist International must be accepted as obligating every member of the Communist Party of America, minority or majority." Another important document was written by the American communists themselves. It said, "The great mass of the working class cannot be formed into organizations consciously under the control of the communists. The communists, therefore, are compelled to function as an underground party. The Communist Party is obliged to penetrate all existing working class and semi-working class organizations to reach the masses, using these organizations as tools and auxiliaries of the Communist Party." The directive made clear that under favorable circumstances, it would be desirable to allow the Communist Party to come out in the open and to appear as a political party. But then it said, "Even though the Communist Party shall have come above ground, the underground organization remains as the directing organ of the open Communist Party." It's important to realize that the open Communist Party, which offers candidates for public office, is not the real organizational force of the movement. It is merely one of the multitude of surface organizations designed to lead the masses. In some countries, such as France and Italy, where communism is viewed merely as a popular political movement, this may be a major channel of mass influence. But in countries such as West Germany, England, or the United States, where the communist label is not popular, it is through the other surface organizations that the underground seeks control of the masses, while the visible communist apparatus serves as a decoy to lull the electorate into believing that the movement is small and harmless. Manipulation of the public is an important part of communist strategy, but the second and equally important objective is paralysis of the target government. For this to be accomplished, it is necessary for the underground to infiltrate into the government itself.
I was one of the editors of the Student Review, which was a more or less communist, it was a communist-controlled student paper. And Edmund Stevens.
Nathaniel Weil joined the Communist Party at Harvard in 1932 after becoming convinced that capitalism was doomed and that the only other alternatives were communism or fascism. Shortly afterward, he obtained employment under the Roosevelt administration in the Department of Agriculture.
After I had been at the job for about a year, when I was 23, I received a telephone call from a voice which simply identified itself as Hal from New York. And Hal asked me to meet him at a restaurant in a part of town which government officials did not frequent. I inferred, of course, that Hal represented the Communist Party. And he told me that his name was Hal Ware. He said the decision has been taken to organize a special secret cell of communists who will be totally separated from the party and will include only those people who are believed to have a big future in the government of the United States. This unit will be under the direct control of the Communist International, and you will have nothing to do with the Communist Party or any member of it. We were under no circumstances to engage in communistic talk. We were not to indoctrinate anybody, and we were not to try to recruit anybody.
A lie on that is not considered a lie. Tell us some of your activities when you were a card-carrying member.
Well, I think they're the usual activities for a communist member, participating in picket lines.
In November of 1945, Elizabeth Bentley revealed to the FBI that for 11 years she had served as an espionage courier between an agent from the Soviet Union and members of the American Underground Organization, most of whom held key positions within the United States government. When she was assigned this position, she was told to destroy her party card and any other documentation that might prove she was a member of the party. In her book entitled Out of Bondage, she describes the instructions of the Soviet agent. He said, "You are now no longer an ordinary communist, but a member of the underground. You must cut yourself off completely from all your old communist friends. You cannot even be known as a liberal and move in progressive circles. Instead, you must pose as an ultra-conservative with a slight leaning toward fascism." Larry Grathwohl became a member of the Weather Underground Organization in 1969 as an undercover operative for law enforcement agencies in Ohio. Before breaking away and testifying in 1970, he had risen to the rank of courier and carried directives from the Central Committee to the operating units within various cities. After explaining how the Weather Underground serves the purposes of the Soviet Union with control exerted through Cuba, he then explained the importance of what are called sleepers in the Soviet underground.
However, I can tell you that while I was with the Weathermen, we had certain people that were recruited out of universities that were not allowed to attend meetings, that were dealt with on an individual basis by the person that recruited them. And the idea was for this person's record to be absolutely clean so that he or she could work themselves into key positions of authority and responsibility, and therefore be able to do a lot of damage at the right time. Obviously, it would be best if they were in the government somewhere, but or in public utilities. But really, it was sort of like you go on and make your career as best you can, and when the time comes, we'll let you know. So this person could be a vice president or a president of a corporation, multinational or otherwise. Primarily, it was to keep them out of the limelight and keep their records clean. Law enforcement was an area they'd like some of them to get into.
As a result of the testimony of scores of individuals from within the communist movement, we're able to get a clear picture of one of the most important components of the underground structure. This is the elite corps, the moles in high places. They have special assignments that require deep cover, and they're considered too valuable to risk being exposed, even to the rank and file of dedicated communists who themselves may belong to other parts of the underground. The important question, of course, is to what extent has this communist underground been successful? Lies the history of subversion by bribery, blackmail, or terrorism. But the subversion of government from within government is a gigantic subject by itself, and it is to that history that we shall turn our attention next.
The Communist Party in the United States was officially established in 1919, only 2 years after the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia. During the following 2 decades, over 100,000 American citizens flocked into the party. Unemployment and economic depression had convinced them that capitalism was crumbling, and a fear of the rising specter of fascism led them to embrace what they believed was the only alternative. By 1941, when the United States and Russia became allies in World War II, many people viewed American communists as merely patriots and socialist dreamers. And it was in this atmosphere of benign acceptance that the party consolidated its penetration into government. In fact, attempts even to investigate communism were firmly opposed at the highest level.
The National Maritime Union was then under control of the communists, it's not now, and they were putting their operatives on ships, and they had a network of intelligence.
Robert Morris, for many years, has been a key figure in the anti-subversion program of the federal government. He was chief counsel to the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and during World War II was the officer in charge of the counterintelligence unit of the 3rd Naval District in Washington. After describing how President Roosevelt had ordered the Navy to allow Communist Party members to serve as radio operators with access to secret military communiques, Mr. Morris then turned to the subject of Soviet defector Viktor Kravchenko.
So we had to meet him clandestinely, and he was with the Soviet Purchasing Commission. And he had with him evidence substantive for that purpose, but instead they were using it to build up a large navy in the post-war period to take on the British and the Americans. And I had extensive evidence of that.
When Morris brought this information to the attention of his superiors, he was met with cold indifference, was transferred out of intelligence work, and sent to a battle station in the Pacific.
Went down there and gave him all the evidence because Kravchenko was standing by, ready to give more information. So I thought it was quite a coup. And 2 days later, I received orders to get out of the country with only 2 days' notice. Apparently it came to the attention of the White House, and the White House didn't want anyone checking up on what the Russians were doing here.
The Office of Strategic Services, known during the war as the OSS, was created to carry out clandestine operations against the Axis powers. It was headed by General William Donovan. It is now known that Donovan, instead of screening out members of the Communist Party, actually made contact with party functionary Eugene Dennis and recruited OSS personnel directly from communist ranks. In Yugoslavia, the OSS vigorously supported the communist resistance forces under Joseph Broz Tito and cut off all supplies to the anti-communist forces under Draza Mihailovic. At the end of the war, the Nazis attempted to surrender to General Mihailovic and to the Americans, but the Allied command refused the offer and insisted that the surrender must be made only to Soviet troops, thus ensuring that Yugoslavia would be in communist hands. Back in the United States, when the FBI provided General Donovan with evidence that some of his OSS personnel were members of the Communist Party, he replied, "I know they're communists. That's why I hired them." After the end of World War II, the OSS became the CIA.
Roosevelt issued an order to the Civil Service Commission that investigators were forbidden to ask any questions concerning the communist backgrounds or communist affiliations of any applicant for the federal service.
Otto Otepka, for 36 years, was an internal security specialist for the federal government. In 1953, he became chief security evaluator for the State Department.
This included, of course, people in such key components of the government as the Office of Strategic Services. One of the most ridiculous things I ever heard of as a part of the relaxation of the security procedures then in effect by the Roosevelt administration was an attempt by the president to allow the Soviet Union to have an NKVD office in Washington, D.C., while in reciprocity, the United States would be allowed to have a branch of the OSS in Moscow. Now, when one knowledgeable studies the composition of the OSS from its inception, who would be ahead in that situation? Obviously, the Soviet Union.
Why is that?
Well, because of the OSS, as history has now established, was comprised at the very top in key positions with individuals who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union.
Many of the early recruits by such events as the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939, the Soviet invasion of Finland, and the bloody purges by Stalin. The innocent idealists dropped out of the party, but by this time many of their comrades had become hardened revolutionaries and continued to follow. Some of those who left the underground came forward to tell their story, and it is through their testimony that we have learned about those who remained behind. Whittaker Chambers was one of those who broke away. Chambers revealed that for 14 years he had been a dedicated communist and had acted as liaison in Washington for a group of communists who held high-ranking positions in the federal government. Elizabeth Bentley was another one who broke from the party in disillusionment. She had held a position similar to that of Whittaker Chambers and had dealt with many of the same people.
We
we're getting information from the Army, particularly the Air Corps, from the Treasury, from the State Department, from the OSS, from the CIA.
Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley described the existence of 3 underground groups, or cells. The oldest of these was the Ware Cell, formed by Harold Ware, an official of the Department of Agriculture. The Silvermaster Cell was under the direction of Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, an official of the Farm Security Administration. And the Perlow Cell was headed by Victor Perlow, an official in the Treasury Department. Over 80 persons were identified by name as part of this espionage network. The following is but a brief sampling from that list. Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, First U.S. Director of the International Monetary Fund, author of the Morgenthau Plan for the dismantling of post-war Germany, member of the Advisory Committee of the OSS. Laughlin Curry, Administrative Assistant to President Roosevelt, Specialist on the Far East, Personal Presidential Envoy to China. Harold Glasser, Assistant to Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department, U.S. Economic Advisor to Foreign Governments, Advisor to Secretary of State George Marshall, helped determine which countries would receive U.S. economic aid. Major William Ullman, United States Air Force, Materiel and Service Division in the Pentagon, access to restricted military information, document photography specialist for the Silvermaster Cell. Also named were Frank Coe in the Treasury Department, John Apt in the Department of Justice, Nathan Witt, Henry Collins in the Department of Labor, Sonia Gold in a Congressional Investigative Committee, and in the OSS, Maurice Halperin, Donald Niven, Duncan Lee, Helen Tenney, J. Julius Joseph, and Donald Wheeler. But perhaps the best-known name of all was Alger Hiss.
Ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor. Then the committee can judge and the public can judge whether to believe a self-discredited accuser whose names and aliases are as numerous and as casual as his accusations. The other side of this question is the reliability of the allegations before this committee, the undocumented statements of the man who now calls himself Whittaker Chambers.
I don't hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting. I've testified against him with remorse and pity.
Alger Hiss began his government career as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Later was employed in the Department of Agriculture, moved to the State Department, and rose rapidly to the rank of Assistant Secretary of State. Was official advisor to President Roosevelt at Yalta, where major decisions were made affecting the fate of post-war Europe and China. Supervised the writing of the United Nations Charter. Was chairman and acting Secretary General at the founding meeting of the UN. In 1939, was identified as a communist agent by 2 independent sources, the French Intelligence Service and Whittaker Chambers. The reports were ignored and he was promoted. Again, in 1945, was implicated by the testimony of Elizabeth Bentley. Again, the reports were ignored and he was promoted. Was identified a 3rd time in 1946 by a Soviet defector in Canada, and again he was retained and promoted. Finally, after being identified a 4th time by former communist Hedda Massing, was convicted in 1950 for perjury in connection with his denials of espionage activities. Was released from prison in 1954 and began a public campaign to vindicate himself as the victim of a frame-up. In the years following the conviction of Alger Hiss, Nathaniel Weil became yet one more former member of the Soviet underground who testified that to his personal knowledge, Hiss was guilty as charged.
The answer to that is that I attended with Hiss probably, at a guess, 30 meetings of the cell. The cell never contained more than 8 or 10 members while I was in it. And I would also meet them at parties, so that I knew Hiss, even though I did not like him too well. I don't mean I disliked him. I mean he impressed me as a cold, calculating person who had a certain fanaticism about him, a lack of the human qualities that one likes. But I knew him well, so there was no problem in my mind as to identification.
I was not guilty of any of the things Mr. Chambers charged, except that I knew him briefly.
Were you ever a communist?
No, didn't happen to be.
It is estimated that for every person exposed by the testimony of former communists, there are many more that have remained undetected. Elizabeth Bentley stated in 1952 that while she was in the espionage groups working in Washington under Soviet direction, groups that were so important that not even she was allowed to learn of their identities. Neither of these cells have ever been exposed. In September of 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. Western scientists were stunned because of earlier predictions that Soviet nuclear technology was at least a decade behind the United States. The story of how the Soviets so quickly acquired this technology begins with the American Lend-Lease program during World War II. Great Falls, Montana was the location of the U.S. Air Force base that was used for Lend-Lease air shipments to Russia. Major George Racy Jordan was the officer in charge of this operation from 1942 to 1944. In his book, From Major Jordan's Diaries, he revealed that in addition to the expected crates of food and machinery, the Soviets also were being sent large numbers of black suitcases, which he was told were diplomatic luggage. Becoming suspicious, on one occasion he conducted a surprise inspection of these suitcases and found every one of them to be filled with such documents as maps of military installations and harbors, blueprints for weapons under development, photocopies of tens of thousands, and countless file folders bulging with official documents of the federal government. Written across the front of one folder were the words, "From Hiss." It contained hundreds of military reports. One suitcase contained scientific and engineering documents, highlighted with such strange-sounding words as fission, cyclotron, proton, neutron, heavy water, uranium. Included also was a map labeled Oak Ridge, Manhattan Engineering District. And attached to these materials was a handwritten note on official White House stationery addressed to Anastas Mikoyan, the number 3 man in the Soviet Union. The note was signed by Harry Hopkins, the American official in charge of the Lend-Lease program, President Roosevelt's personal advisor and friend. In 1943, Hopkins at the White House spoke with Major Jordan by telephone, told him to expedite a special shipment that was coming through and not to make any official record of it. When the mysterious cargo arrived, it was identified as uranium salts. The shipment was sent through, and as requested, no official record was made, except in Major Jordan's diaries. In September of 1945, a Russian code clerk named Igor Guzenko, assigned to the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, approached Canadian officials and asked for political asylum. This is the only photograph of Guzenko ever released to the public, and it was not published until after his death in 1982. While working at the Soviet embassy, Guzenko had become dismayed by the fact that his superiors already were preparing for a new war following the defeat of Germany, a war against the entire non-communist world. As a code clerk, he had access to all secret communiques, and he brought many of these with him to prove the truth of his allegations. Wearing a hood here to preserve his anonymity as a protection against reprisals, Guzenko revealed that there was a group of Canadian citizens with important positions within their government who in reality were agents of the Soviet Union. But the most electrifying disclosure of all was that the network included one of the top scientists working in cooperation with the United States on the atomic bomb project. His name was Dr. He was second in authority only to the head of the Canadian project. He had provided the Soviets with information about the secret test of the bomb, and he had delivered to them actual samples of uranium. When confronted with the evidence, Dr. May confessed that everything Guzenko had revealed was true. Another British scientist on loan to the United States was Dr. Emil Klaus Fuchs, who had been assigned to work at the top-secret facility at Los Alamos, New Mexico. He was one of the few people at that time who had knowledge of how to construct the bomb trigger mechanism. Under questioning, Dr. Fuchs confessed that he also had been working with the communist underground, and that he had given the Soviets drawings and detailed instructions on how to assemble and explode the atomic bomb. The confession of Dr. Fuchs led investigators to an American chemist by the name of Harry Gold, who was the man who hand-delivered the vital documents and drawings to the Soviet Vice Consul in New York. When Gold was confronted with Dr. Fuchs' testimony, he too confessed, and this led to the exposure of a network of American citizens who were in a position to channel top-secret nuclear information into Soviet hands. The trail led to David Greenglass, the man who made the actual drawings of the bomb's trigger mechanism, and to his sister, Ethel Rosenberg, and her husband, Julius, who were convicted and executed for their part in coordinating the espionage operation. At the conclusion of the trial, federal judge Irving Kaufman declared that this was the crime of the century. He said, "I have searched my conscience to find some reason for mercy. It is not in my power to forgive you." Also convicted at the same trial was Morton Sobel, who had attempted escape to Mexico to avoid prosecution. And finally, the trail of espionage led to Professor Philip Morrison, who admitted earlier Communist Party membership and who had access to virtually all secrets of the A-bomb while employed at the Manhattan Project. In retrospect, it is now clear that the detonation of the Soviets' first nuclear weapon in 1949 was an achievement not of research and science, but of espionage and subversion. Following the disclosure of the Soviet theft of America's nuclear technology, congressional committees began to take an interest in learning more about communist penetration into government. In 1947, for example, Louis Boudens was called to testify before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He had served as the managing editor of the official communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, and had been a member of the party's national committee. Boudens later revealed that one of the government's most respected experts on China, Owen Lattimore, was a member of the communist underground.
In this cell, there was also Owen J. Lattimore. This I know from reports received in the Politburo and given to me officially as managing editor of the Daily Worker.
Owen Lattimore was the man who was sent to China by President Roosevelt to serve as the official U.S. advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese leader who then was struggling to prevent a communist takeover of his country. John Stuart Service was another State Department China expert who came under investigation. In 1945, Service was found responsible for transmitting hundreds of classified and top-secret documents to the staff of Amerasia magazine, a communist-controlled publication. There they were copied and transmitted to the Soviet Union. Service was reprimanded for indiscretion, but not released from employment. In fact, he was later promoted to head of the State Department's Information Service. The Senate Subcommittee on Investigations uncovered evidence of similar problems in the government printing office, where many classified documents are printed and distributed. Also in the Voice of America program, which was designed to reflect the American viewpoint through radio broadcasts in Europe. And in the American Overseas Libraries, which were part of the State Department program, supposedly to combat communist propaganda abroad. The CIA and its predecessor, the OSS, came into the spotlight on numerous occasions. In 1952, the head of the CIA, General Walter Bedell Smith, stated publicly that he was sure there were communist agents working inside his organization. No less than 3 defectors from the Soviet KGB have stated that this is so. They are Anatol Golitsyn, Yuri Nosenko, and Mikhail Golanevsky. Although their testimony has been clouded by controversy, the fact remains that there never has been an outside investigation of subversion in the CIA. The military is another critical branch of government that never has been investigated for possible communist penetration, even though there is evidence that serious problems may exist. In Italy, for example, in 1967, Giorgio Rinaldi confessed that he had been part of a Soviet underground operation involving 300 officers in NATO, some of whom were American military officers. In 1954, Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Rastorov of the Soviet Secret Police sought political asylum in the West. He had been the director of Soviet espionage operations in Tokyo. After coming to the United States, he revealed that he personally had worked with several members of the American Military Intelligence Service. In 1964, Swedish Air Force Colonel Stig Wennerstrom admitted that for 14 years he had transmitted information to the Soviets regarding nuclear strike capabilities of NATO and the United States. When asked where he obtained this information, he replied that it was from the head of the American Intelligence Service at the Pentagon. Turning to the legislative branch of government, Senator Barry Goldwater in 1975 was interviewed on television and revealed that communists had infiltrated into the office staffs of as many as 9 members of Congress. This information, he said, came from the CIA commission of which Vice President Rockefeller was a member.
I was told when I was flying to the funeral of Chiang Kai-shek with Vice President Rockefeller that his committee had learned of instances where the offices of senators had been infiltrated by Soviet agents or Soviets or some sort. I said, "Are you going to publish that?" He said he would, but it was never published. I asked him once why it wasn't. He said, "I was requested not to publish it." Now that you've asked me, I'm going to...
It was never revealed who requested the Vice President not to release these findings. Infiltration into legislative staffs is a major accomplishment for the Soviets. But even more important is the placement of agents into the legislature itself, men who are legally elected to office. In 1961, the House Committee on Un-American Activities published a report entitled "The New Role of National Legislative Bodies in the Communist Conspiracy." This report revealed that a number of communists, posing as Republicans or Democrats, had been successfully elected to the state legislature of Washington, the Michigan Senate, and the United States Congress, and that the Communist Party had boasted of its role in helping to elect candidates in a number of states, including California, Ohio, New York, and Illinois.
By the mid-1950s, the underground apparatus of the Communist Party was in serious trouble. The one thing a conspiracy cannot survive is exposure. Yet a steady stream of former communists and FBI undercover operatives gradually was exposing the entire operation to public view. This was accomplished primarily through congressional investigative committees, which put the testimony of these people into the public record. And one of the most important aspects of this history is the fact that even though the President and the heads of various government agencies repeatedly were informed by the FBI and given names with documented proof, almost never were these Soviet agents removed, and in fact many of them were promoted until the investigative committees of Congress stepped in, made the information public, and created external pressure for action. As far as the communists were concerned, something had to be done to stop these committees. And it is the story of how they succeeded in that counterattack that we shall take up next.
There's no contest between Senator McCarthy and the Department of the Army. All that Senator McCarthy has been trying to do is expose the communists who have infiltrated the Department of the Army.
The late Senator Joseph McCarthy, in the minds of many, has become the symbol of anti-communism in America. His detractors have used the word McCarthyism to mean political hysteria and lack of concern for the rights and reputations of innocent people. His defenders view him as the fallen warrior against the hordes of pro-communists in both government and the press. It's not our purpose here to retell the McCarthy saga, but it is important to observe in passing that McCarthy's critics seldom have challenged his basic facts, choosing instead to condemn him on questions of 205 security risks in the State Department. No one denied that such people were on the payroll, but they attacked him because he was not always consistent with the number of names on his list. When he said that there were pro-communist books in the overseas library program, there was no question of it, but he was condemned instead for book burning. No one denied his claim that security risks were employed at the secret testing laboratories at Fort Monmouth, but they criticized him for obtaining this information from a document he was not authorized to have. And when he charged that General Ralph Zwicker had protected and promoted a known communist in the military, his facts were never challenged. He was attacked instead for losing his temper and speaking harshly to a brigadier general.
You hear all this talk about Senator McCarthy's methods, usually in a derogatory sense, like people saying, well, I agreed with his fight against communism and his goals, but I didn't agree with his methods.
In 1951, Roy Cohn had served as the assistant federal prosecutor in the trial of atomic bomb spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. But from 1953 to 1955, he was the chief counsel for the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, of which Senator McCarthy was chairman.
Somebody like Bill Buckley will take the position that, well, his controversiality maybe in the long run hurt the cause and things like that. I don't buy that. Somebody had to make this fight. Senator after senator had declined to do it. It was a dangerous fight because, as we've discussed, you were taking on the media, you were taking on people with vested interests in covering up these communist activities, and it took a man who was a man to do it. And Senator McCarthy was that man. So you can say by his fearlessness and his courage, he made himself an open target for the enemy. Well, that's true. I suppose he did. But that was a risk of the game which he was willing to take and which I think the results he achieved. And I, again, keep coming back to where we are today, because you have to view everything in perspective. If the communists had turned out to be a bunch of pussycats who held free elections in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria and so on and so forth, and who never went near Afghanistan, or who embraced solidarity and said, you want freedom, you've got it, I'd look like an awful fool today, and I wish I did. But unfortunately, history has proved the opposite, that what we were yelling about 25 years ago has all come true, and there isn't that much left of the free world.
Regardless of the controversy surrounding the career of Joseph McCarthy, regardless and above all others, the destruction of his political career and the placement of the word McCarthyism into the American vocabulary was the turning point in the fortunes of the Soviet underground. From that moment forward, any outspoken anti-communist could be discredited in the public mind merely by labeling him a McCarthyite. The next phase of the campaign against internal security was to convince the general public that communism is not an internal threat to the United States, but that investigative agencies of our own government are. Members of the Soviet underground have worked diligently to promote this point of view through a host of non-communist organizations which they control. Their public pronouncements do not call for the defense of communism, which would be unpopular, but instead for the protection of civil liberties, freedom of association, and the right to political dissent. One of the first organizations to serve this function was the American Civil Liberties Union. It was formed in 1920 by Roger Baldwin, who publicly advocated the right to overthrow the government by force and violence. He also said, I am for socialism, disarmament, and ultimately the abolishing of the state itself. Communism is, of course, the goal. In a letter to an associate, Baldwin gave this advice. He said, we want also to look like patriots in everything we do. We want to get a good lot of flags, talk a great deal about the Constitution and what our forefathers wanted to make of this country, and to show that we are the folks that really stand for the spirit of the Constitution. Among the founding membership of the ACLU were such notables as William Foster, who later became the head of the above-ground Communist Party, USA, Felix Frankfurter, who later became a Supreme Court justice, Dr. Harry Ward, of the spokesman for the Communist Party. It was inevitable that the ACLU would become the first non-communist organization to oppose the investigative committees. It carried out a public opinion campaign in favor of the censure of Senator McCarthy, and by 1960 had made the abolition of the House Committee on Un-American Activities one of its primary objectives. One of the functions of the ACLU is to provide free legal services. Most of its officials are lawyers, and many of them belong to an organization known as the National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild was formed in 1937 with the assistance of the American branch of an agency of the Soviet Comintern. It has been described by the communists themselves as a transmission belt for the Soviet underground. A committee of Congress officially declared it to be the legal bulwark of the Communist Party. Members of the National Lawyers Guild have provided legal defense and, in some cases, financial assistance to such groups as the Weather Underground Organization, the Puerto Rican FALN terrorists, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, and the Symbionese Liberation Army. In 1975, William Kunstler and other members of the National Lawyers Guild offered their support to the leaders of the West German terrorist Red Army Fraction, better known as the Baader-Meinhof Gang. They even attempted to send a team of lawyers to Germany to aid in their legal defense. One of the members of that team was Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General of the United States. Perhaps the most conspicuous group within the National Lawyers Guild has been the New York law firm of Rabinowitz, Boudin, and Standard. Leonard Boudin is the father of Kathy Boudin, one of the leaders of the Weather Underground Organization. Victor Rabinowitz, his law partner, has been identified as a member of the Communist Party, and their law firm is an official agent of Cuba in United States courts. By the early 1950s, the Communist Party had launched 3 additional organizations designed to build public opposition to the investigation of communism. The first of these fronts was called the Civil Rights Congress, which used the theme of defending minority rights as a means of raising money for the legal defense of Communist Party leaders. The second was the National Committee to Abolish the Un-American Activities Committee, in which 7 of the 13 national officers were identified members of the Communist Party. The third was the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, officially cited in 1958 as a communist front. Frank Wilkinson has been an organizer for both the National Committee to Abolish the Un-American Activities Committee and the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee. On 2 separate occasions, he has been identified in congressional hearings as a member of the Communist Party. Wilkinson currently is head of a new organization, the National Committee Against Repressive Legislation, and is sought after as a public speaker, particularly on college campuses, where he is presented merely as an advocate of civil liberties. Let us turn now to an actual event to see how these people and organizations have been able to achieve their objective. The event was a public hearing before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, held in San Francisco on May 12, 1960. The purpose of the hearing was to gather testimony regarding the influence of the Communist Party in the San Francisco area. Frank Wilkinson is one of the first organizers to arrive on the scene. Working through a group, American Freedoms, he helps coordinate the distribution of thousands of copies of a speech by Congressman James Roosevelt, in which the House Committee on Un-American Activities.
Well, have you had anything to do with the demonstrations in front of the City Hall today?
No, I've just been an observer of those.
I understand.
Wilkinson and other members of the Soviet apparatus in California formulate a 4-point strategy for attack against the committee. First, they will generate public opposition to the hearing. Secondly, they will pack the hearing room with people who are hostile to the committee, drawing heavily upon radicalized students from the university. Third, they will disrupt the hearing with tactics of open defiance, forcing the police to use crowd control measures to reestablish order. Fourth, they will treat the utilizing news coverage of the action as evidence that repressive measures are used against innocent protesters. The packing of the hearing room comes off exactly as planned. The handful crowd that comes not to listen, but to protest. When the room is filled to capacity and hundreds are turned away, communist agitators seize upon this as a propaganda device to disrupt the meeting. From left to right, we see Ralph Izzard, Archie Brown, Sally Etarian Sweet, and Saul Wachter.
Open the doors! Open the doors! What are you hiding? What are you hiding? We have nothing to hide. What are you hiding? Let the people live out here. You want America? Then get out, you want America. That's what you should do. Pack up and get out. You are. Open the doors. Here comes the goose squad. This is Americanism. Watch this Americanism in action. Wow, watch this Americanism in action. Watch this American.
Douglas Wachter, son of Sal Wachter, is a communist-trained student organizer at the Berkeley campus of the University of California. He also was an official delegate to the Communist Party's recent annual convention. Pleading the Fifth Amendment when asked about his party membership, he presents himself not as an agent of a foreign power, but as a patriot whose only concern is to defend the Constitution.
I cannot cooperate with the committee in answering any such questions. I feel I have an obligation as a citizen of this country to preserve the Constitution, and I do not feel I can do so in good conscience by allowing the House Un-American Activities Committee to inquire into my beliefs or associations.
On the second day of the hearings, California State Assemblyman Philip Burton addresses a rally of protesters and calls for the abolition of the committee. His sister-in-law, Michelle Burton, was an official delegate to the 1962 Communist World Youth Festival in Helsinki. Burton himself has established a long record of support for officially cited Communist Front organizations. Philip Burton later would become a member of the United States Congress. William Mandel is a well-known news commentator over radio station KPFA. In due course, he is called to testify about evidence of his role in the Communist Party as an instructor in tactics.
If you think that I am going to cooperate with this collection of Judases, of men who sit there in violation of the United States Constitution, if you think I will cooperate with you in any way, you are insane. This question has no purpose other than to harass me. When I was asked this question last in 1943 by the late Joe McCarthy, and let me say that I am honored when people come up to me on the streets, perhaps I don't deserve this honor, and say, you're the man who killed Joe McCarthy. Because I happened to appear on the first day of the book-burning hearing, and I did my best to conduct myself in the manner which I'm conducting myself today. If there were any such evidence against me under any law, the proper authorities could move against me. This body is improperly constituted. It is a kangaroo court. It does not have my respect. It has my utmost contempt. And I am not going to answer that question, sir.
By noon of the second day, the unruly crowd has grown to such proportions that it now blocks access to other rooms in the City Hall, and the jeering and chanting interfere with proceedings in courtrooms on the third floor. It is inevitable that the judges are compelled to register official complaints with the police, who now have no choice but to ask the demonstrators to leave. Taking orders from their leaders, the crowd refuses to budge, even in the face of fire hoses. The result is a media event of great proportions, as the protesters are unceremoniously removed, one by one. The final phase of the strategy, as you recall, was to force the police into using crowd control measures, which then could be offered as evidence of alleged police-state brutality against innocent and peaceful demonstrators. And so it was. The People's World, the official communist newspaper in San Francisco, prepared a special supplement which was widely distributed on college campuses and to waterfront workers. Thousands of leaflets also were distributed entitled From Blackmail to Blackjack. The leaflets said that students were peacefully demonstrating and defending the most cherished American freedoms when fire hoses, clubs, and blackjacks were used against them, without warning and without provocation, to browbeat and smash the public opposition to the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The same theme, in one variation or another, also was carried in much of the nation's non-communist press. Well, that was 1960. By the 1970s, the campaign against internal security had greatly expanded in terms of the number of people and organizations involved, in terms of professionalism and sophistication, and also in terms of objectives, because by this time, the target of attack had broadened to include not only the investigative committees of Congress, but all intelligence gathering operations. In our next program, The Open Gates of Troy.
What they were doing there was making bombs. They were making anti-personnel bombs. They were taking 4 or 5 sticks of dynamite, hundreds of heavy nails, and taping the nails on the outside of the dynamite so that when it exploded, it would send those nails out in every direction, and of course, any one like a bullet. So they would have killed hundreds of people had they been successful.
But because of my activities and other people's activities, the weathermen had to spend a lot of time trying to determine who the informants were, who the police agents were, and this distracted them from their goals.
The 2 disinformation departments, again under the supervision of the Soviets, decided to start a long-term operation against the CIA.
I believe in the naming of the names of CIA people working abroad.
I think anybody who thinks that the Communist Party of the United States is a serious threat to the security of the United States in any way.
Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
In the 1st century BC, it was the Roman poet Virgil who immortalized the story of the Trojan horse. After 10 years of warfare, the Greeks hadn't been able to breach the impenetrable walls around the Trojan city of Troy. Finally, they devised a scheme for accomplishing through trickery what they could not achieve by military might. They built a large wooden statue of a horse and placed it outside the city gates, supposedly as an offering to the gods and a tribute to the Trojans, who were led to believe within its wooden belly. That night, while the Trojans slept with pleasant dreams of peace, the soldiers crept from their hiding place, overpowered the few sentries who remained on guard, and from the inside opened the gates of Troy. Legions of warriors waiting on the outside rushed into the defenseless city, and roaming through the streets at will, massacred the population. When they left, it is said that every building had been destroyed, and no living thing remained behind. Now, there is much in common between the ancient city of Troy and the United States of America. In the past, our walls have been impenetrable against the armies of all hostile foreign powers. But now we're told that there no longer is any danger, because our enemy has mellowed and gone. Is it possible that we too have been lulled into pleasant dreams of peace, while there are those who even now overpower our sentries and pull upon our gates from the inside? The answer to that question is the subject of this program.
In Part 1, entitled Moles in High Places, we pose the proposition that America's retreat from victory since the end of World War II was the result not of a confusion factor, but of the subversion factor. we reviewed the official Soviet strategy for utilizing subversion as a method of conquest from within. We took a look at the record of early communist success in penetrating into the highest levels of our government. We saw how these disclosures were met with indifference or hostility from the executive branch, the courts, and Congress itself. We saw men who were blatant security risks continue to rise in federal employment. And finally, we documented the process by which the Soviet underground in the 1960s launched a successful campaign to disrupt and discredit the investigative committees of Congress. By the 1970s, the drive against internal security was ready for the next stage of development. In June of 1971, Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo of the RAND Corporation were charged with espionage and theft of government property when they delivered for publication certain highly classified documents, which became known as the Pentagon Papers. The publishing of these documents provided the Soviets with an effective anti-American propaganda weapon in Southeast Asia, and also gave them the key to our secret diplomatic code, a key they could use to decipher hundreds of older messages recorded and stored for just such a breakthrough. Ellsberg and Russo claimed that freedom of the press gave them the right to obtain and publish these documents. A team of National Lawyers Guild attorneys was assembled for their defense, and the head of this team was Leonard Boudin of the law firm Rabinowitz, Boudin and Standard, a registered agent of Cuba. Also active in the defense was an organization called the Institute for Policy Studies. Sometimes described as a think tank for the left, the Institute for Policy Studies is headquartered in Washington, D.C. It has served as a clearinghouse for disgruntled or disloyal government employees to leak information to the press that will damage our diplomatic or military operations in other countries. One of the founders of the Institute for Policy Studies was Richard Barnett. In his book, Intervention and Revolution, Barnett describes communist movements and terrorist campaigns around the world as being merely local struggles for power with no connection to the Soviet Union. It is Barnett's position that the Soviet KGB is not aggressive in these activities, and that local communist leaders are independent of Moscow. In his book entitled The Economy of Death, he wrote, "If a country in Asia, Africa, or Latin America goes communist, the Soviet Union or China does not necessarily benefit. Revolutionary regimes, even communist ones, do not make the United States any weaker militarily or the communist powers any stronger." One of the goals of the Institute for Policy Studies has been to weaken and neutralize the CIA. This is also a goal of the KGB. In spite of the fact that the CIA already may have been compromised by communist agents within its ranks, and in spite of the fact that in many countries it has supported the worst possible non-communist leaders among the contenders, still, in some countries, the CIA has done much to slow down communist progress. And as long as it remains in operation, there is always a chance that it could do great future damage to Soviet plans.
I believe in the naming of the names of CIA people working abroad, or in the United States for that matter, because I think that people around the world ought to know, as a matter of principle, with whom they're dealing. That is, if they're dealing...
The name of Philip Agee has become synonymous with the drive against the CIA. Agee had been a CIA operations officer in Latin America. He resigned in 1969 and began work on his book entitled Inside the Company, CIA Diary, which became an international bestseller in 1975. The theme of his book was simple. The CIA is on the side of evil, engaged in a senseless and cruel campaign against an imaginary threat of communism. Agee frankly supports the activities of the KGB and even complains that the Soviets are not doing enough in the area of secret operations. In the conclusion of his book, Agee revealed his personal ideology. He said, "Reforms of the FBI and the CIA." In the June 1975 issue of Esquire magazine, Agee was even more blunt when he said, "I aspire to be a communist and a revolutionary." In 1977, Agee was deported from Britain for his activities on behalf of the KGB. One of the persons who came to his legal defense was Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General of the United States. As early as 1974, Philip Agee had become associated with a periodical called Counterspy, which published the names and addresses of CIA officers stationed in other countries.
I believe that by exposing the identities of CIA officers abroad, it will make it that much harder for presidents of the United States, through the CIA, to install the Pinochets of today and tomorrow.
One of the names published by Counterspy was Richard Welch, attached to the U.S. Embassy in Athens, Greece. Shortly after his name was revealed, Welch was ambushed and killed by local terrorists. Similar assassination attempts have been made on U.S. officials in other countries immediately following the public disclosure of their names. In July of 1978, Philip Agee traveled to Cuba to participate in the 11th Communist World Youth Festival. While there, he announced the formation of a new publication called the Covert Action Information Bulletin. An editorial in the first issue stated, "We will never stop exposing CIA personnel and operations whenever and wherever we find them." It's likely that some of the names released by the Covert Action Bulletin actually were CIA officers working under cover of other occupations, but many were not. In fact, one source for acquiring these names was the Soviet disinformation departments of East Germany and Czechoslovakia. One of the men responsible for compiling this list before seeking political asylum in the West was Vladislav Dittman, the officer in charge of the Department of Disinformation in Czechoslovakia.
The two disinformation departments, again under the supervision of the Soviets, decided to start a long-term operation against the CIA, making life as hard as possible for CIA. That is to label many American diplomats, politicians, cultural representatives abroad as CIA agents and paralyze their positions. Specifically in 1966, the first major operation was to prepare a book which is called Who is Who in CIA. Shortly after coming to the United States, I found this book in many bookstores. I have it at home. Covert Action Bulletin, or...
Is this Agee's group, the group?
Yes, that's right. It's one of the major sources of information about CIA man. Of course, that's ironic, because that is a communist disinformation.
Another anti-security organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. is called Security Studies. It is directed by Morton Halperin, who traveled to England with Ramsey Clark to assist in the legal defense of Philip Agee. Halperin previously had been employed in the National Security Council as the senior assistant to Henry Kissinger. Halperin, in fact, was the man who personally prepared the Pentagon Papers for the government before they were illegally transmitted to the press. Later, he spent 5 months working with Leonard Boudin and other members of the National Lawyers Guild as a special consultant in the defense of Ellsberg and Rousseau. Mr. Halperin has become another prominent spokesman for the point of view that there is no threat of communism, that we can best combat the secret operations of the KGB by ourselves doing everything in the open, and that there is no need for us to be concerned over Marxist-Leninist movements in any country.
Absurd. The notion that there is a Marxist-Leninist conspiracy in the world, in light of the very, very substantial differences between various countries who call themselves Marxist-Leninists, is absurd. I think the only people left who take Marxist-Leninism seriously are American right-wingers who have a need for seeing a conspiracy opposed to them. And I think
during our interview, Mr. Halperin remained soft-spoken and composed while discussing questions of civil liberties and constitutional rights. But when we asked him about the Communist Party connections of his associate Leonard Boudin,